The college football season is finally here. Georgia will face UT Martin Saturday at Sanford Stadium. I am joined by our Georgia beat writer, Chip Towers. We're standing in front of Woodruff Practice Field, where Georgia has put in a ton of work over fall camp heading into this season. Instead of doing a straight preview of the UT Martin game, Chip and I decided we would go through and give you a couple things to watch heading into the season. So the first thing I want to ask you, Chip, offensive and defensive players to watch.
Oh, my goodness. How can you ever take your eyes off of Brock Bowers? But I think, there's a lot of interesting personalities and new faces on the offense. And one that I'm really intrigued to get a look at is Dominic Lovett. I mean, there's been a huge buzz about the transfer from Missouri this year. You managed to stay healthy throughout camp, which is a big deal here. And he was a big playmaker for Missouri, their leading receiver last year. Stepping into that slot receiver role, I think he's going to have a huge year for Georgia. Defense, obviously there's a lot of good players over there. But I think one guy that may be popping out to people this year would be Tykee Smith. And I say that because Tykee Smith will be starting at the star, and Javon Bullard, who was a huge star as a star last year, has moved back to safety. Just the fact that Georgia would be willing to take a player like that out of the lineup and move him to another position tells you they feel really good about Tykee Smith, and that is a huge playmaking position for the Bulldogs. I say Tykee Smith could be a player to watch on defense this year.
Mine for offense is receiver Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. I think he's going to have a huge year for Georgia. And for the defense, defensive lineman Mykel Williams led Georgia in sacks last year, so he's not going to shock you by having a good season, but I do think he's a player who's always fun to watch. Okay, if you had to pick offensive and defensive MVPs today, hard to do, but we're going to give it a whirl, what would you say?
I don't think there's another player on the planet like Brock Bowers. And gosh, you're talking about a Heisman Trophy candidate at tight end. So, I think that's your MVP no matter really what happens. The offense is going to be geared around him. If Georgia has great success, he will have had great success, Brock Bowers.
Defense?
Defense, I think everybody thinks of Pop, right? Jamon Dumas-Johnson, a.k.a. Pop, that's what everybody calls him on team. That's what Kirby calls him. He's in the middle of that defense. He has been the strategic and motivational leader for Georgia last year, really, but this year especially. He's the man to watch.
Okay, breakout star. And this needs to be a guy who did not play much last season. I'm actually going to go first on this one. This might surprise some people because we just talked about how amazing Brock Bowers is, but I do think I see sophomore tight end Oscar Delp having a big season for Georgia as well. We saw last year Georgia knows how to work two tight ends. So I think both of those guys can have an amazing year. Breakout star for you, Chip.
Can I put Tykee Smith in two places?
You can put him in, so you can put him in as many as you want.
Actually, you mentioned this guy in another thing, but I think Mykel Williams is going to become Georgia's next All-American. He's dealt with a little bit of a foot issue coming into from the off season, but he's well now, and he was pretty much unblockable toward the end of the season as a defensive end. Look out for number 13, Mykel Williams.
Next up, most intriguing storyline going into the 2023 season.
Well, it's a lot of people are going to say three-peat, right? And it's a historical thing, and that's going to be a storyline. We've written extensively about it at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. But I just think a quarterback change anytime is always intriguing, is always exciting to watch. And Carson Beck is going to tell his story here this season. So he doesn't know how it's going to turn out. Kirby doesn't know how it's going to turn out. We don't know how it's going to turn out. And from my standpoint, that intrigue is great.
Okay, biggest potential weakness, which might not seem like there's many, and there's probably not when you're a two-time defending national champion. But like Kirby Smart says, this team cannot rest on the laurels of the past 2 years. What is this team's biggest potential weakness?
Well, I think right now it's, RBU just really doesn't have a great back ready to go at this moment. Maybe at some point Kendall Milton will be that guy or Dejon Edwards, but injuries have absolutely decimated the position. And, I think Georgia might have, if there was anything they maybe didn't do a great job in the offseason was recognize how fragile they were at that position, maybe get somebody out of the portal. I mean, I don't know how good the market is in the portal for running backs. I can't sit here today and say somebody might have been available, the other guy. But they are precariously thin at the running back position. This is RBU. You always got to have some run game working for you. That's where I'd say there might be a little bit of a weakness.
I'm going to go a different direction, and this one is not necessarily Georgia's fault, but this schedule, I think, might be a weakness for Georgia in the sense that it takes you a lot of weeks to face a more competitive opponent, or what a lot of people would say is a more competitive opponent. And even when you get to your SEC schedule, I think there's the expectation that Georgia should dominate week in, week out. You don't have that Oklahoma game anymore that you can put on your resume heading into the college football playoff if you get there. I think the schedule could be a potential weakness for Georgia. You got to make sure you don't get complacent going into the postseason. Game you're most excited for, that being said.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody here is going to point to the November 18th game at Tennessee. But you know what? That game is so far off. I mean, it could end up being nothing, or it could end up building and building into the matchup like we saw last year at Sanford Stadium when it was basically 1 versus 1. This year, I mean, that road game early, September 30th at Auburn, is very intriguing to me because you really don't know anything about Hugh Freeze and Auburn and what they're going to look like. I think Jordan-Hare Stadium is one of the toughest places in the SEC to play, and I know for a fact, having a future son-in-law coming in as an Auburn grad, they are so excited about that game. It's sold out. You can't get a ticket anywhere. Look out, September 30th, Georgia at Auburn.
For as much as we just talked about the schedule, I think one interesting thing to consider going into this season for Georgia is it almost seems like the expectation or vibe is if Georgia doesn't win it all again, like how crazy is it that if you don't three-peat, could it be a letdown? It's wild to think about. So my final question to you is, how does Georgia define success this season? Is that a fair expectation?
Well, it definitely is when you look what this program has done the last 2 years and what it's trying to do this year. I mean, I think it's clear that if Georgia does not win a national championship, that it will be a disappointment. Now, I say that you got to look at this as a two-pronged thing. There's the team, there's inside the locker room, and there's the fans. So who are we talking about here? If you're talking about the fans, they're going to be disappointed. They're going to be disappointed if you don't get to Atlanta. They're going to be disappointed if you don't get to the college football playoff. And doing all that, they're going to be disappointed if you don't win it all. And I think that's reasonable. That's what fans do. That's why they're fanatics. Now, inside the locker room, you know, Kirby talked about it a lot in the preseason, that it's just about getting the most you can out of the team that you have. And when you look at that standpoint of this team, I think it's a championship caliber team. So, again, I think anything short of a championship, SEC or national championship or playoff, will be a disappointment or, short of success.
It is crazy to think that that is the state of things in Athens,
That's right.
But that's the state of things in Athens. Chip, thanks so much for joining me. Thanks to all of you for watching. Make sure you go to ajc.com or subscribe to our YouTube channel to find more videos just like this one.